So before we get into the content of metadata schemas and how they work and whatnot, let's talk a little bit about where metadata comes from, because the history of metadata will tell you an awful lot, I think, about why metadata schemas are the way they are. And let's go really far back in time to the origin of metadata. And I would argue, actually, that the origin of writing is the origin of metadata. That, to a certain extent, writing is metadata inherently. And I might even go a little further than that and argue that language is metadata. Now, this is getting into a fairly heavy philosophical discussion that we could have if you want to, but if we're talking about metadata as representing things, right, then I think you could make a reasonable case that language is metadata because it isn't the thing you're talking about, it's talking about the thing. But at any rate, I would argue that the idea of metadata, if not the word, goes all the way back to the origin of writing. And the reason is that some of the earliest writing ever discovered, cuneiform tablets and whatnot, some of those are account keeping, right? This particular image of a cuneiform tablet is an account of livestock being sold, or I can't remember exactly whether it was sold or inventoried, but right, it's essentially bookkeeping, and bookkeeping is absolutely metadata about, right, the things being maintained. So later, like 3,000 years later, along comes the Library at Alexandria, which is what this is an image of, this is maybe not actually what the ancient Library at Alexandria looked like, but this is an image supposed to be the Library of Alexandria. So the Library of Alexandria wasn't a library the way we know it today. There's some debate over what the ancient Library at Alexandria looked like, and there may have been more than one over centuries, but that's not the point. The point is that the Library of Alexandria at least mostly collected scrolls, which of course you can see in the background in this image, because the codex book may not have been invented yet. That was probably invented by the Romans, but it didn't really become popular until Gutenberg. Mostly books were scrolls at that time. But even when you're keeping scrolls, you need to keep track of what you have, and it's not clear how many scrolls the Library at Alexandria had, the ancient library, but by some estimates it's as many as 500,000, which is a pretty sizable collection even today, right? You're not going to find much in 500,000 scrolls unless you have some kind of accession list, right? Some kind of list of what you own. And so basically, shelf lists got started in that kind of a context. And most likely, that was subject cataloging, right? It's not clear, again, how the ancient Library at Alexandria was organized. All of that has sadly been lost to the mists of time. But it seems likely that there was at least some subject cataloging, because if you're going to the Library at Alexandria to do whatever research you wanted to do 2,000 years ago, you needed to have some sense for where things were going to be, and subject is among the most logical ways that could have been done. Fast forward about, 1,500 or 1,800 years, and you get the card catalog. Now, the card catalog, of course, is also subject cataloging, but it's also author and title cataloging. So on a single card, you get 3 access points, maybe more, but at least 3. title, author, and subject. Those are sort of the big three in library metadata. It's like, the holy trinity of library metadata is title, author, subject. Now, museums, right? Museums, author doesn't really make much sense, right? Subject may not make much sense, particularly, when you're talking about natural objects. If you're talking about artifacts, then, creator, in the Dublin Core sense of creator, might make sense because somebody actually, made that calyx, even if you don't know who that was, because they're, 2,000 years dead. But subject doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're talking about bones, for example. Right? So museums and archives and other kinds of, cultural heritage institutions that collected natural objects needed a different set of access points than title, author, subject. Then along comes computers, right? The PC, there's a long history of PCs that I won't get into here, but the first commercially available PC was rolled out in 1981. And shortly after that came spreadsheet software. Now, spreadsheets, the first spreadsheet software was a piece of software called VisiCalc, which came out in 1979, which actually was before the PC rolled out. But then VisiCalc came out for the earliest PCs and was very widely used for a long time. I remember VisiCalc being the most popular Office product of its day when I was a kid. Basically, spreadsheets are tabular data, right? It's just, it's like what Excel is now, basically. It's just a way of representing data in a grid with headers and whatnot. Before spreadsheet software was invented, back in the 50s, back shortly after the invention of the computer, when computers were still the size of rooms, people had already invented databases, right? The computer science and theory of database design goes way back, and what you get with database design is an entity relationship model. Now, ER diagrams, if you've taken systems analysis, this is not going to be anything new. Entity relationship diagrams and models are a later development. Databases were developed before ER diagrams were kind of fully ironed out as a way of organizing the content of a database. But at any rate, databases and ER models go hand in hand, really, because what you're talking about is the entities that are represented in database fields, and then the relationships between those entities. Right? And you can represent that in a flat file database, but ER diagrams really are kind of married to the notion of an object-oriented database, which I'm definitely not going to get into. But the point is that ER diagrams are metadata describing the things that are represented in databases. And databases are really kind of central to the way computing works. Now, this is a screen capture from the Oxford English Dictionary, and it shows the history of the word metadata. So, we've just gone all the way back to like 5,000 years BC with cuneiform tablets, but the word metadata doesn't show up in English until 1969. The idea of metadata at that time was pretty much exactly what we mean by it now, right? Categories of information about each data set as a unit in a data set, right? It is data that is contained in a data set about another data set, right? Essentially, that's exactly what we mean by metadata now, except that this usage is a little bit computer science heavy, which you'd expect from 1969. Shortly thereafter, 1970, along comes the MARC record, which I'm really not going to get into, because if you want to know about that, take, cataloging. But the MARC record is metadata designed for computer-based library systems, right? It stands for machine-readable cataloging. So you've got two things that are really interesting in the context of metadata about the MARC record. One is that it's cataloging in the same way that the card catalog card is cataloging, and in the same way that a shelf list is cataloging. It's a way of keeping track of resources. It's a metadata record about a resource that's part of a larger catalog. And the other part that's interesting about the MARC record is the M part, the machine part. This is not intended for human consumption. Right? You can read pieces of a MARC record for sure, but it's not designed for human readers. It's designed to be easily parsed by computers so that MARC records can be passed back and forth between networked systems. Right? So suddenly, we have the emergence of metadata records that are specifically designed for A, library environments, and B, machines with very little thought given to how humans are going to interact with that record. So, this is just the thin edge of the wedge, and we'll talk, I think, more about the development of metadata for libraries later, but this was a really fast thumbnail sketch history of the history of metadata.